Hello and welcome to another edition of Counting on Law. Last week, I spoke to you all about the daily misery of using an Indian court website. It's unreachable when you need it and unreliable when you reach it. It's tempting to conclude that maybe courts just need better web designers and web developers. After all, they could hire the best in the country or the world by tomorrow and rebuild every single court website within a month. But that's not going to really change anything. Look, a court website is just an access layer to an underlying dataset that compiles all the case events, filings, listings, orders, judgments, adjournments, and this must be updated regularly for every case. Think of it as a window that lets you peek into a house. You can paint the window or you can, change up the interiors, but that will only change how things look. It won't fix the shaky foundation that the house has been built on. The eCourts project is nearly 2 decades old. It began in 2007 after the Supreme Court's E-Committee prepared an action plan from 2005. And that original plan was almost entirely about infrastructure. How to get courtrooms access to computers, laptops, operating systems, Wi-Fi, and, train the staff to use these tools. There was little to no focus on data management, which is how should a case be identified, what forms part of its process record, how the provenance or the history of an entry is established, and who's responsible for maintaining the integrity of the data. The National Judicial Data Grid, or the NJDG, arrived in 2013, and with it came, some attempt to standardize some of the reporting. And this worked partially. But because there are so many differences in practice and in terminology, and sometimes even the laws, every state and district decided to use its own nomenclature for different case types. So now district courts have recorded over 800 case types, and the NJDG tries to squeeze them into roughly about 30. Now, this idea of a local difference is not itself a problem because, no one should force Kerala and Kashmir to speak the same language. But in the absence of translators, and because nobody has done the work of mapping these differences into a common structure, the reporting doesn't permit useful analysis. Now, the reasons for this are somewhat historical. The original unit of administration was the individual courtroom, one courtroom with one judge, and this was treated as an entity unto itself. This is why in courtrooms across the country, there is a case number 1 for every case type every year. It's more like roll numbers in a classroom than some kind of universal identity like an Aadhaar. So there are now different practices, different numbering systems, and different ways of recording things like interim applications, which are actually part of a case, but sometimes they're treated as separate cases entirely. Now, there is a unique identifier, which is the case numbering record or the CNR, but it's almost never used in court documents. As a result of this, if you ask questions, which are almost like basic questions, right, which is what is the most common cause for litigation in India, or what cases take up the most time across different courts, there's really no simple answer. We've showed some of this in our previous work on Bombay High Court and, counting cases. There are issues with how we count pendency, with how we measure court utilization, and it's really difficult using this data to understand where the court spends its time. If you visit any court website, you will see a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is funny because it says, neither the courts concerned, nor the National Informatics Center, the NIC, nor the E-Committee is responsible for any data inaccuracy or delay in the updation of the data on this website. We do not accept any responsibility or liability for any damage or loss arising from the direct or indirect use of the information provided on the site. So, who really manages the data? This absurd abdication of responsibility is symptomatic of the many issues that have crept up over the 2 decades of trying to do, code digitization. Last week, I told you that, different high courts have their own websites, but they don't just have their own websites. Some of them, like Kerala, have built their own case management system. Now, this is despite the fact that if you look at the case information system or the CIS, which is now CIS 4.0, this is the centralized case management system set up by the Supreme Court E-Committee. It looks really impressive, when you look at the spec sheet and you look at all the features that it's supposed to provide. The idea was actually pretty good. The idea was to create some kind of national core with common functions and a periphery that every state will adapt to. But many courts have started complaining that it's too rigid and too dependent on the NIC. And this is not the NIC's fault. It must consider requests from all states. And it's really hard to fix one system that works for the entire country. Let's take e-filing, right? Now, this has become mandatory, and it's become mandatory gradually in many places, but with a lot of protest. Even today, there are some stragglers. The Madras High Court had a blanket mandate for Tamil Nadu's district courts. And this mandate was suspended in January 2026 after lawyers pointed to courts that, that courts don't have scanners and, there's no bandwidth. There are like internet constraints in some of these courts. So their annoyance is kind of justified because if you think about it, what happens in a case information record, you file the case online, but it doesn't flow into the workflow of the court. And the court still demands physical registers. So we hear a lot of talk about courtroom digitization, but if you visit any court in this country, you will experience the reality that lawyers and litigants are carrying around these large files and court staff are like physically transporting tomes of cases from one courtroom to the other. In fact, when a district court case gets appealed at the High Court, the records are physically transported, right? So it's not really that surprising that lawyers don't see the point of e-filing. Why do additional work when the system will eventually default to the old way of working? Or what's the point of painting the pipes when the plumbing is broken? A good data layer is the basis to any project of digital transformation, because technology is not just useful when it changes the way information is accessed, like, through a website or through a dashboard, but technology becomes really useful when it changes the way you work, when you change how the information is captured, how the data is managed, and how it's actually used for decision making to make things better for the users, whether it's the litigants, the lawyers, the judges, or the court clerks. A good system must help administrators make better decisions instead of just defaulting to the same instincts and solutions that we've been repeating ad nauseum for so many years, which is we need more money for the justice system, we need more judges, or we need more tribunals. A good step to getting this right would be to define a core set of data standards. What do you mean by a case? What is the definition of a hearing, a listing, an order? There should also be some standard protocols to communicate information exchange between two forums. And the court really needs to provide access to all this information through APIs, as well as providing machine-readable documents as opposed to scanned PDFs. If you think about it, the success or failure of a public system is to look at the industry that has spawned. When India built dependable payment rails through, the digital public infrastructure of Aadhaar and UPI and made payments easier, you see an enormous fintech sector growing. Court data has produced like a dark mirror of sorts. There are players like Indian Qanun, Pro Vakil, and courtsdaily.info. That's the website we run. And their value today lies substantially in just cleaning, reconciling, and reserving data from official websites. Imagine that if Swiggy had to, start naming the streets and numbering the houses and build its own map before it could start delivering food. Or imagine Hyundai came to India and discovered that manufacturing cars came with a side business of repairing the roads. What we need, when I say we, I mean, every user of the court needs, is the state providing reliable information and a robust data infrastructure. Different high courts and district courts, once you're provided this infrastructure, can build applications on top of this. Some of it can be in-house, some of it can be outsourced. But these applications can then be designed for local configurability. That will hopefully give rise to multiple experiments and for different innovations. And these different innovations will then solve for the local priorities and problems, which will then also invite less resistance in adoption, because you're trying to solve for problems that the local, people, the users of the local court experience. The eCourts Phase 3 project comes with a budget of about 7,000 crores. This was almost close to $1 billion when it was approved in 2023. That money can go two ways. We can either buy more paint for the windows and do some interior decoration, or we can choose to rebuild the foundation. Or at the very least, we can cement the cracks that have crept in. Set up some data standards, definition, APIs, so that the systems that are built on top of this actually stand. It's high time we rethink our approach to court digitization. Thank you.